Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to take a couple minutes, probably no more than 5 to 10 minutes, and talk about an aspect of the process of cellular respiration that we didn't quite get to last semester. But it's called fermentation. And fermentation is one of the oldest and most primitive, and in other words, one of the most conserved processes in all living organisms. All living organisms, from the most simple bacteria and archaea to the single-celled eukaryotic organisms to the cells of multicellular and very complex plants, animals, and funguses and humans, all of these cells have the ability to carry out the process of fermentation. Because of this, it is shown and it is known by scientists that fermentation was actually one of the first energetically efficient processes of all organisms. And whether or not an organism is carrying out cellular respiration most of the time and fermentation part of the time, or fermentation most of the time and not cellular respiration at all, like some organisms cannot carry out cellular respiration if they don't have organelles, it's still important to understand the two types of fermentation and how they're important to you and me. Now, there are two types of fermentation. One is called lactic acid fermentation, and the other is called alcoholic fermentation. All right? Lactic acid fermentation is a type of fermentation that results in the formation of something called lactic acid. All right, so glucose is being made into pyruvate in glycolysis, just like we know in the cytosol. Produces 2 ATP, or 2 net ATP, and produces 2 NADH as well. And this pyruvate actually gets reduced or gets electrons added onto it in the form of hydrogens by the same molecule that was produced in glycolysis. All right? So pyruvate gets made into something called lactate, which actually in time becomes lactic acid. All right? And the organism produces 2 ATP. All right? Important things to understand here are how our electron carriers are being used. All right? NADH gets used to make pyruvate into lactate, but the NAD plus that got oxidized or ended up reducing lactate ends up going back and getting used in the formation of another 2-pyruvate from another glucose molecule. All right. Now, if we go to alcoholic fermentation, well, let's go back here. Lactic acid fermentation is most common in bacteria and many multicellular eukaryotic organisms like ourselves. If we go to alcoholic fermentation, it mostly occurs in yeasts, which are very small single-celled eukaryotic organisms. This process, alcoholic fermentation, same thing. Glucose is made into 2-pyruvate, all right, making 2 ATP, but the pyruvate gets made or gets automatically made into something called acetaldehyde, which is the loss of 2 carbon dioxide molecules, all right, 1 per acetaldehyde. And the carbon dioxide is this one right here. Remember, this pyruvate, if it was going into the pre-TCA reactions, we'd still lose these carbon dioxides. All right. So in alcoholic fermentation, we have an intermediary here, acetaldehyde. All right, and then it gets reduced into something called ethanol. All right. Ethanol. Both of these things are actually toxins to the human body, which is why your body, when people drink alcohol, it will actually get broken down as quick as possible by the cells. But humans don't do this type of fermentation. For our purpose, it's mostly done in yeasts. All right. So the two types of fermentation are lactic acid and alcoholic. They're both basically the same, except for lactic acid fermentation, pyruvate gets made into lactate, and alcoholic fermentation, pyruvate gets made into ethanol with an acetaldehyde intermediary. All right. Now, these fermentations are two of the most important things that go on in the world today, and economically, they're extremely important to you and I. All right. Now, alcoholic fermentation. Remember, we're producing ethanol from the production of glucose. All right. This mushroom here, called the inky cap mushroom, it's called inky cap because it actually degrades slowly into an ink, all right, that can be used to draw, all right, but it contains a molecule called coprine, all right, and coprine, when it gets hydrolyzed or broken by hydrolysis, a hydration reaction, becomes aminocyclopropanol, all right. Now, important thing is aminocyclopropanol acts as an enzyme inhibitor to something called alcohol dehydrogenase, all right? So when people drink alcohol, they have an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase that breaks down the acetaldehyde and the ethanol so it doesn't become toxic to the human cells in the bloodstream. Now, this mushroom here actually has a molecule that, when hydrolyzed from coprine to aminocyclopropanol, inhibits the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, making acetaldehyde and ethanol toxic to the body because the body can't get rid of them. All right. So, inky cap mushroom actually is a very edible mushroom. All right, except that it becomes very toxic in the presence of alcohol because this coprine becomes aminocyclopropanol in the body, inhibits alcohol dehydrogenase, and makes the person who has any alcohol in their system extremely sick as a result. All right. So there are interactions with fermentation processes with other things in the natural world that matter to us. Now, alcoholic fermentation, remember, we're producing ethanol from glucose, all right, and actually does not occur in the presence of oxygen, all right, is involved with things like making beer and wine and mead, which is beer or wine made from honey, into making bread. And this thing is called kombucha. Kombucha is a fermented green tea that also includes both a lactic acid and alcohol fermentation. But fermentation has been important in medieval times because the water wasn't always safe to drink because people were pooping and peeing into the rivers and streams all over the place. And so the water wasn't really that safe to drink, but what people found was that beer and wine was generally safer to drink than water because it went through a heating process usually, and also a fermentation process. All right. Breads are made from yeast. Yeast use the sugars in the flour of the bread to produce carbon dioxide and rise, which makes the bread nice and fluffy and baking. All right. So alcohol fermentation is extremely important to our everyday lives. If we move on to lactic acid fermentation, all right, things like kimchi and yogurt and sauerkraut, sour beer, yogurt, and soy sauce, these are all things that are produced by a lactic acid fermentation, often a bacteria, all right, that produce different types of flavors. All right, here what you're looking at is a soy sauce production facility in Japan, and soy sauce is basically just fermented soybeans. All right, yogurt is fermented dairy. All right, which also includes the sour creams and the cottage cheeses and the whatever else, the cream cheeses and things like that. The kimchi is fermented cabbage, all right, or pickled cabbage, all right. So all these things are important and you've definitely probably heard of. All right. Here we have the production of what looks like a cottage cheese from a fermentation that's using the sugars in the milk in order to produce a substance. Lactic acid fermentation is also a fermentation that our cells, that human cells, undergo. All right. Somebody running for a long period of, if somebody's running for a long period of time but not very hard, all right, their cells are producing energy in the presence of oxygen, and they're very much able to break down glycogen, which is how we store energy, into its small glucose pieces so that we can use glucose through cellular respiration. But as you increase the amount of energy use per time that you are doing, your cells actually are not able to get enough oxygen to supply the TCA and the electron transport chain. So what happens is you end up using glucose in the process of a lactic acid fermentation to produce 2-lactic acid or lactate, all right, making only 2 ATP, all right. As we move up into an even more rigorous exercise regime, we're going to move into another lactic acid fermentation, but it's also called the phosphagen system, where different phosphates that are present in the cell are going to be used to produce ATP instead of glycolysis or even fermentation. So all these three happen in the human body and in some way are related to a lactic acid fermentation. All right. Here we have just a quick graph that shows when each system is going to be used. The aerobic system, this here is cellular respiration, this here is fermentation, and this here is called the phosphagen system, which we'll talk about later in the year. All right, but glycolysis, or just fermentation, glycolysis to lactic acid, is when you're producing a high amount of ATP, all right, and your ability to produce ATP is low because we're not going through TCA and electron transport, because we don't have enough oxygen, because we need more energy in that. All right, glucose and glycogen are used for these processes here. Okay, aerobic system we've been talking about all in the last 2 weeks of the year. This is the cellular respiration. We don't need that much ATP. We can produce tons of ATP as a result of the TCA and electron transport, and we're using glucose and glycogen in order to do that. We can do that as well. So that's a little skinny on fermentation. Fermentation being the production of either ethanol in alcoholic fermentation or lactic acid in lactic acid fermentation to produce energy in the form of ATP, and using electron carriers to reduce pyruvate to its products.